My name's Gregor Muir. I'm director of the ICA. It's lovely to see you here all this evening. We're delighted to welcome Larry Bell to the ICA. Thanks so much for making this event possible, Larry. You've been a great sport to allow me to put this talk together with people here so quickly.
You may be sorry.
But I really thank you for that. Just to say that your work was a huge inspiration to me as a young art student. And I always remember cherishing a publication of your works for many years at a time when your work wasn't overly familiar here in the UK. But later in life, when I came to work at Tate Collection, I always remember myself, Francis Morris, and Donna De Salvo insisting that an example of your work should be on permanent display at all times, especially at the then newly opened Tate Modern. So I was a huge supporter, and so it is a genuine honour to see you and to be meeting the man who produced the shadow of ghost boxes, the cube sculptures, the vapour drawings, the mirage works, and also these incredible works that you've been producing more recently. Huge thanks also to Tim Marlow, I'm sure you all know, Director of Exhibitions at White Cube, award-winning broadcaster and man, who's about to be beamed into 40 countries with his personalised tour of the current Manet show at the Royal Academy. Tim has been such a great supporter of the ICA over so many years, both in terms of his being prepared to be here tonight at a moment's notice, and also as a much valued member of the ICA Council. Tim is in fact very, very familiar with this room. It's the first time he's probably been in here without the council papers to hand. So anyway, just to say, Tim, really thanks a lot for agreeing to do this tonight.
Pleasure.
Tonight would not have been possible without the help and support of Mariam Eisler, and we really look forward to Mariam's latest endeavours, and that of Hossein Amir Sareji, and their latest book coming out soon, which will be a record of their American odyssey of studio visits across America. Also thanks to Anne Field at Transglobal Publishing for helping to support this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Larry and Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Larry, it's probably a leading question to start with, but about categorization. But I've read all sorts of descriptions of how you're located. It's usually space and light, but perceptualism, I've read, radiant minimalism, which I think is a wonderful phrase from Dave Hickey, fetish finish, which I particularly like. But I wonder whether those kind of terms, or more broadly, whether the notion of being seen as part of a group, after all, your first showing in London with 1970 at the Tate was with Bob Irwin and Doug Wheeler, so that was the kind of Californian light and space at school. Does grouping mean anything to you, anything more than just a term of convenience?
Well, it's nice to be included. I really don't, I never felt I was part of any particular kind of movement, but I liked the fact that other people thought I was doing something that was part of something else, and so I never took much of it too seriously. I just tried to carry on with my work.
Did you work, I mean, I want to talk about some certain collaborations perhaps later with people like Frank Gehry, for example, but when you were cutting your teeth as a young artist in the 60s, Bob Irwin, I know, taught you for a time, but I mean, were you in and out of Bob's studio or Doug's studio, or was it still a solitary or singular practice then?
No, there was a lot of, we hung out together mostly because it was pretty intolerable. Just, in those days there wasn't very many people to talk to about things, and so your interlocutors were those who wanted to participate, and the closer the studio was, the easier it was to walk to, and so those are the people I hung out with. Bob, I actually moved to the area where Irwin had a studio, and Bankston, and Ken Price, and Ed Moses, and those guys, and we shared a kind of common humor about things. So we didn't share much about theory because nobody wanted to intrude on the other's brain about theory. It was easier to just talk about funny things.
Does theory, does it resonate for you now?
No.
Did it ever?
No. No, I tried to Yeah, as you said, Irwin was a teacher of mine at art school, and my first semester at art school was his first semester teaching, and so he was an incredible teacher. It turned out that his most important message was simply to the first thing to learn was how to trust yourself, and after that, you were on your own.
I read, which I thought was a wonderful remark of yours, that you said that you were most interested in beginnings, and you still are, how work comes about, the conception of it all. How did you decide you wanted to be an artist? I mean, was it a kind of moment of revelation, or did it just slowly become apparent?
I went off to art school because I was unsuited for anything else. My parents told me when I graduated high school that I could go to work, go into the army, get a job somewhere, go to school, but it never occurred to me that there might be other options. I chose to go to a professional school. I liked to draw cartoons when I was in high school, and I thought I'd go to school that was a training ground for Disney's animators, and I thought I'd get work in the movie business. And but part of the curriculum of the school included in the beginning painting classes, and I liked the painters better than the more technical people, and I liked their attitude. I just decided I want to be with these guys at whatever they're doing. I didn't have any idea what painting was all about or anything, but it was kind of a there was a, I don't know how to say it, but there was a humor about it all that resonated with me, and I liked that humor, the edge of humor. It was very important.
And so you started painting.
Yes.
What about what about the moment when you started also making sculpture? I mean, there's those famous, oft-quoted, maybe cliche and untrue remarks about, it's been attributed to Barnett Newman and others, that, you know, sculpture was something that you tripped over when you stepped back to get a better look at a painting. But did sculpture feel like a field of greater or expansive possibility, or do you not distinguish between your paintings and your collages and your drawings and your sculptures now?
Well, I do now, but at the time it was the first paintings after that kind of abstract expressionistic works were very organized. Things that were canvases that were shaped like a tessera, a flat cube, and I don't know why it went that direction, but it did, and I worked the permutations that were obvious in the work, beginning with the illustration of a volume that ultimately became. I realized that I was illustrating volumes, and instead of illustrating them, I should probably try and actually make the volumes in some manner. And I started making some constructions that incorporated glass in them. I had a short-time job at a picture framing shop where I learned how to cut glass, and in the shop they sold these little shadow boxes that you put objects or something in, and I used to make these little constructions in the spare time with glass and paper and cracks in the glass that were just happened, you know. And there was one particular piece that the cracks I wasn't intending. The crack just happened when I put it into the box. The glass split, and I just left it in. I could have thrown it away, but it had just happened, And so I decided, well, if the crack happened, then that's part of what it's supposed to be. And stretched a piece of paper behind the cracked glass and looked at it. And I realized that the crack did other things. It cast a shadow on the piece of glass. It cast a the crack in the glass cast a shadow on the paper, and it also reflected light back up onto the paper. So there were 3 lines that were created by the crack. One was the reflection above the crack, one was the shadow below the crack, and the crack itself. And that profoundly moved me, that there were this thing had taken place, that I was the manipulator of these materials, but I wasn't expecting either the crack, the reflection, or the shadow. But they were very, very strong elements, each one. And there was something about the serendipity of them happening in kind of a symmetrical way that attracted me. And so I started playing around with the glass. And I was interested in the glass. I wasn't quite sure why, but it was cheap, available anywhere, and did things that no other material did. It reflected light, it transmitted light, and it absorbed light all at the same time. And one could simply make a slight adjustment in the position of something in relation to the ambient light, and the crack, the reflection, and the shadow would change. And so I played around with these small constructions, and then went back into the paintings and did one very large painting that was not a square; it was a rectangular shape, and after I finished this thing, I realized that the subject matter of the painting was actually the volume of the skylight that was just above where I painted, and that the corners of the well that had the glass skylight above it were a containment of space, and the glass allowed the light to come in and so on, and I really was probably more impacted by the right angles of the room itself than I was by anybody else's art, and because I wasn't on a mission to make a painting, or I was just doing something. I was hands-on something. And
so you didn't know what you were trying to achieve. The process was the journey through which you took yourself somewhere
correct.
else.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because you beautifully undermined my next question. As you were talking, I was thinking Duchamp. I mean, glass cracking afterwards, and then you went. But I wasn't interested in other artists particularly. I was interested in right angles. But I'm still going to ask you the Duchamp question, then we'll come back to the right angles. Because I know that you met him at some stage, but were you unaware, or was it irrelevant, or was your encounter with Duchampian ideas and the glass and so on, was that a chance encounter, and then you suddenly thought, yeah, there's something interesting here?
It was totally chance. Duchamp came to Los Angeles to look at the Pasadena Museum for his first show, and it was arranged by a man named Walter Hopps, and Walter was part owner of the gallery that I was associated with, and Walter gave Bill Copley and Richard Hamilton were with Duchamp, and they were going around to different artist studios, and there was a knock on the door. Nobody ever knocked on my front door. They all come to my back door. So the only people that could be in front were building inspectors. You weren't allowed to live in these stores, you know. So I didn't answer the door. But for about 20 minutes, there was a gentle knocking every few, you know. And so finally, I walked up to my little peek hole and looked out, and there were 3 guys there. and they did not look like building inspectors. And so I opened the door slightly, and immediately Bill Copley stepped forward and introduced himself and introduced me to the other two gentlemen we're with. Well, I was born with a severe hearing loss that wasn't diagnosed for years later. And so I didn't hear the names. I didn't know that. But when Copley said, Walter Hopps gave us your address, and I let him in, I thought maybe they were collectors, you know. And they were walking around the studio, and Hamilton was explaining to this other man what he was doing, what I was doing, and this and that, and it wasn't correct. And so finally, I'm listening very carefully, and finally I had to correct what he was saying. And then this other gentleman said something, and then Copley said, "Didn't you do something like this, Marcel?" And then I realized who it was, this fellow that looked sort of familiar, you know, and then I couldn't talk anymore. Anyway, so that was my introduction to. I knew nothing about Duchamp's work with glass, and I knew very little about Duchamp at all, actually, at that point. It wasn't until his show at the Pasadena Museum a year or so later that I saw the depth of this guy, and was I was profoundly happy that I had a visit from these people, even though I couldn't talk anymore.
I love the idea that you encountered Duchamp first by looking through a peephole, given his second most famous work, Etant Donné, involved exactly that process, but you didn't recognise him. So, okay, that was a great diversion. Let's go back to right angles then. Because it's, I think, again, I've...
Excuse me. All right, it's all over. There we go.
There might be someone interesting. You can
No.
You made the point actually, and then as I was reading it, you're saying that there are more right angles around us than probably anything else, and of course once you realise that, you start looking and seeing them everywhere. But so you noticed this thing about the right angle, and then that became something that you then explored in your own work. Was that in combination with the ellipse? Because every time I read about you in the right angle, you say, well, I'm obsessed with 90 degrees or right angles, but also 140-degree ellipse is also interesting, because that's the way we see everything.
40-degree ellipse.
Sorry, 40 degrees, yeah.
Yeah. Well, for some reason I was interested in simple things that were impinged on our peripheral vision, you know. And you mentioned the right angles. I defy anybody to count the number of right angle relationships that impinge on our peripheral vision just in this room. You can't do it. There are too many.
Well, it'll make the next council meeting I have in here a bit more interesting, I should think.
Well, and the ellipse is another shape like that. You know, here are three round glasses that we are viewing at roughly a 40-degree angle, and so this elliptical plane, I realize, is something that is, if you look at the tires of your car, you also view them at an oblique angle, and they are also elliptical shapes, and there are extremely powerful forces that pull on us on Earth. It's like the Andromeda galaxy is roughly a 40-degree ellipse also, and so if we think of the bigger picture of those things that influence us, I could say that for me, well, I think the right angles in this room are something that influence me, and I can also say that this simple shape of an elliptical plane also influenced me. And so some of the motifs that I used on the design of the earliest cube constructions were elliptical, and that's where that comes from.
So it's what we see, but how we see is the thing that interests us.
It's what comes at us. How much around us come at us without us being conscious of its influence on us. So those were the kinds of things that triggered me.
I'm curious, I mean, not just then, but now, about your working processes, because it seems to me that potentially, from what you've said, art can be suggested wherever you are. But do you have to go through particular routines or rituals in the studio, or are you full of ideas, and in the studio it's a question of just deciding which one you're going to go with?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it other than saying that that in my studio I consider the work the teacher. Okay, so if I trust what I'm doing, then I have to mine out of what I'm doing the things that are meaningful to the effort, for the effort put into them. And I've never run out of influences out of the work. The work is the teacher. I follow the work. The work tells me where to go, and I go that direction. And when things seem to exhaust themselves, the where to go next is always in the work, and it's never let me down.
Does material start an idea for you, or do you have ideas and you think, okay, that will be interesting to explore in glass, or that will be interesting to explore on paper or in collage form? How does material work in that way?
Yes, it does inform, but why it informs is more interesting than how it informs. I realized many years after I had been in the studio that my media was neither glass or paper. It was the interface of light and surface, and after I came to that conclusion, it opened another door. But it was the work that informed me of that. It wasn't anything else. I'm a pretty good observer of what I do, but I like to work fast. And when I was doing the cubes, the effort was so arduous that it precluded too much improvisation, and I realized for myself the most enjoyable things came from an intuitive response to something, and then my ability to be improvisational and spontaneous with whatever that feeling that gave me the need to dive into it. So for me, the most important tools were spontaneity, improvisation, and intuition.
But within an ordered framework, in a sense, and then you want chance and spontaneity to take over.
Yes. Yes, it always does.
Do you try and be hands-on in almost every aspect of your production, or are there things that you're happy to hand over?
No, I have just about done everything myself. I like the hands-on aspect of it. And it has something to do with a kind of fear that somebody's going to take. If I give this job to somebody to do, unless I know how I'm going to handle the stuff after I get it back from that person, they're going to go somewhere with it that I won't understand, and then that means it's somebody else's work. It's not mine. The heaviest experience for me was when I came up with some ideas for some bronze things, and much to my astonishment, after the presentation to the potential client, he liked them, and then I received a commission to make some very large bronze pieces. Well, I didn't know shit about bronze, and nor how to work with it, but it was a kind of media that there was a lot of professionals that dealt with it all, And so I reluctantly, I wasn't going to get into the foundry business. And I went to a company to actually make these things, and the models I made were about this big, but they were to be 14 times bigger than I had made them, you know. So what I didn't realize was after they got up to the scale, the point of view that I had in making my models is quite different than looking at the 14 times bigger. And so the immediacy of the little sketches that brought these forms out could be, the immediacy was the charm of the things, and I didn't trust the way I looked at them because I had no experience with it, and so.
So what do you do?
I made them and said they were good, you know.
It's a great answer. Is that an ongoing problem for you? No, I mean in terms of scale, because it wasn't.
No, because I changed my. I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I didn't like the feeling of giving over to somebody else something that I knew nothing about to translate into something that was to be for me. Now I'm seriously considering hiring a firm to make a big glass piece, and but I know something about that area, and I know something about the techniques of how this has to be done, and so I'm less reluctant to do that because I know, but. In the bronze thing, I knew nothing about the material or how it's made or anything else, and so I'm going to not go into arenas that I don't know the tactile aspects of the fabrication.
Do you distinguish in any way between studio-created work on a human scale and some of the larger public commissions you've done? Does it feel part of the same process and practice?
I haven't done that many.
But a few?
A few, yeah.
I mean, is that an area you'd like to expand more into?
Well, given the right... Given the opportunity, I would go after just about anything that was in the arena that I had some competence in and trusted my eye about. But, this is a possibility. I haven't worked with glass for a while, and I've been quite happy with the less arduous aspects of making collages. They're very immediate, and they're very and so I've leaned on that for a while. And when I speak of collages, what I'm actually speaking of is a combination of materials that have different light emissive characteristics and stacking them up. And then forming the final surface so that the light is dispersed off of these various kinds of surfaces the way I want it. That I like, and I'm getting pretty good at it.
Well, I've read that there's 10,000 of these vapor drawings. Is that right?
Well, that was one series. That was one small group. That,
so what are we up to then now?
Oh no, I stopped. You're speaking of something called fractions, yes. And there was a point when I was flat ass broke and wanted to do something big, but had nothing going for me that allowed for that, and so I brought in all of the kind of collage things that I had done before, went through them, and started cutting them up and chopping them up to throw them away, and finally realized, actually not too long after I began tearing them up, that there were moments in each of these little shards of paper that were interesting, and I began combining little pieces of this and little pieces of that and fusing them down onto another piece of paper, and I realized I had actually started working on a new thing, and I just followed that, and after, I don't know, 6-7 months of doing these things, I don't know, we were in 6-7 months, I was up to 150, 200 things to look at, and each one seemed to make some sense coming out of the last one, and I decided to set a goal. So the goal was 10,000 unique images, and it took me 5 years to get through it, but I did them. And we actually did quite a bit more than that. And in this one series of pieces, they were all 10 inches square, and it was a small size. It was easy to work, and it was a worthy project. After I was finished with it, I was very glad I did it. And then the question was what to do with all this shit, you know. And
what did you do then?
I gave some to Bernie. I gave some to other dealers, and I gave some to friends. I gave some just, you know, there's still about 8,000 if you want to.
No, but it's pretty interesting because it's so speed and necessity and flow, but never seeing it as a single project that you might try and exhibit as one work before dispersing.
Well, it did occur to me to do that. That it might be wonderful sometime. So with that in mind, when it came to actually presenting these pieces, I had them framed a certain way so that on the outside chance I could harvest all this stuff back together, they'd all be framed the same, and I could do a big show if there was any chance of.
Imagine the loan forms, 10,000 loan forms to get these back. You said somewhere that collages for you, you described perhaps a certain body of collages as imitation paintings. I thought it was a really interesting phrase. What did you mean by that?
Well, a lot of the work had acrylic paint on it, and a lot of the layers of stuff had acrylic paint on them. The acrylic paint was painted onto a laminate film, a piece of laminate film, let to dry, and then I would take these gestures and place these brush strokes exactly where I wanted them around the other materials. So the work was made of mylar, laminate film, and paper. And so there were these paint gestures that were in the compositions, but they weren't painted. They were actually collaged into it, and but you couldn't tell that they were not painted. They were at one time painted, but placed as a unique object, and so I call them imitation paintings.
Are you interested in a spiritual dimension to art, a kind of transcendental idea that art may embody or be able to trigger?
Say it again.
Are you interested in a possible spiritual dimension to art, and the transcendental aspect that some people feel that art has, particularly abstraction or art that deals with light?
I'm not sure that I do, but I'm not sure that I don't. There's a kind of spirit that moves most artists that follow their own work. You're a student of your work, and that is kind of a spiritual relationship with trust. Trust, again, it comes into it, and you know, some people trust Jesus and I don't, and some people trust other kinds of religious things. I trust very little in that arena, but I do trust that which I have laid hands on and put together into something. I know where it came from, why it exists, and I feel confident that it's honest. And if that's spiritual, then yes, there is some element of spirituality in it, but it has nothing to do with anything other than a close relationship with the hands-on aspect of things.
What about...
Does that answer your question?
It does, actually. It's a very good answer, yeah. It does. What about your relationship to art history? You say at the beginning that one of the motivations was animation, and then there's an element of self-containment in the way you describe things. You've also said that de Kooning was important at one stage, and Bob Irwin at others, but I noticed, for example, you called the work after Gainsborough, and I presume it was because they were the kind of Gainsborough-esque pinks and blues in the glass. But are you now, have you in the last decade or so found yourself exploring a deeper art history? Are you interested in history and art history in that way?
Well, I love to look at things. I like to look at them in... A friend of mine has some of his photography in the National Gallery here, and I went yesterday to look at them and had a chance to in the portrait gallery, and you know, I've been through the entire portrait gallery several times over the last some years, and I find it a very interesting thing to look at these people that are portrayed that were kings and whoever they were, and there's a nice kind of feeling that I get from looking at those things. I don't know how it translates back inside me and comes out. I do know that there's no way that one is not influenced in some manner by what you see. Now, I remember for some reason I very much liked the paintings of Henry Fantin Latour, and I mean I found them remarkable images and
light, candlelight.
Well, they were just amazing, and then I remember looking at some Manets, and in a weird way, the Manets reminded me of Latour for some reason, and then I went back and started looking at pictures of Manet's paintings, and there was what's his name, Lucy Smith, wrote a book on Fantin Latour, and I had a chance to look at images of Latour and look at images of Manet, and I've had the feeling that Manet had taken a great deal of his compositions from the relationship of the flowers and the relationship of the leaves. Little snippets from these things had become great paintings by Manet, and I later learned that Manet was older, but I still was of the opinion that his work was informed by Latour, and I thought that was a pretty interesting personal discovery. I mean, as a matter of fact, I'm absolutely convinced of it, and if one looks at pictures of Latour's work next to a book of Manet's work, they're going to find the Manets in the pictures. I wish
we'd had you on the program on Manet that I've just filmed. Have you seen the Manet portrait show at the Royal Academy?
No, I haven't.
We should try and go tomorrow and take a Latour book. I think there's something interesting there. That painting the luncheon.
Yeah. That's one.
Yeah.
That's one.
Interesting. Very interesting. You mentioned the National Portrait. This is very clunky, but I wondered how I was going to ask you this. You mentioned the National Portrait Gallery. Thinking about pantheons of great people, how on earth did you manage to appear on the front cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club? That's a pantheon of great people. I mean, you were there among the great and the good. You were the great and the good. You are the great and the good. How did that come about?
I honestly don't know. I got the stories I've heard. I got a letter once requesting could they use this image. The image wasn't my image. It was a photo of me that my friend Dennis Hopper took, and so I said, yeah, sure. And I had no idea what was coming out of that. And apparently Peter Blake had been given the job of translating some information from the musicians into this thing. And so I suspect that somebody in the group said they liked my work or something. I did a show with Bob Fraser. My first show in Europe was at Fraser's Gallery, and I would assume that some of them saw that stuff. Somehow, it's hard for me to believe that Ringo was an art lover, but
John was, wasn't he? Broadly speaking.
Well, I don't know. You know, I don't know who. But in answer to your question, I have no idea.
It's great. I love that you were wearing a purple tie on that thing, and that you the
It was a
there.
black and white picture, though.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was a black and white picture. It was colored in. Yeah.
You also said that you mentioned Ed Moses earlier, and again, I love that you made a description that you said you collected avidly when you were younger. I don't know if you still do, but you also said that artists, you were a student of artists' style.
Oh yeah.
And you have a style of your own too.
Well,
Does that still interest you? I mean, no,
yeah.
you meant their personal style rather than their...
Yeah. I meant the personal
the
style.
way they presented themselves.
Yeah. I mean, part of everybody's aesthetic shows up in style, in their personal style. My mother would get up in the morning and dress herself in a certain way. That was her... It was her aesthetic that informed her decisions to how she wanted to look, you know, and so everybody else does the same thing, and I kind of like this statement. I like seeing personal statements like that, how people dress tells you a lot.
What was Duchamp wearing?
He was wearing a dark suit. He wore a dark suit and a little cap, and smoked a cigar, and he held it between these fingers. And I never saw anybody hold a cigar like that before. I thought that was very cool, that he held his cigar like that.
It is. It's a vivid picture. I realise I've taken up slightly more time than I was supposed to before I throw you to the floor. Other questions from the floor? Larry, yeah.
I'm afraid I'm very deaf, and so you must speak up.
I was slightly surprised by something that you said earlier, because I think of you in terms of the boxes.
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear you say that you like to work at speed.
Yeah.
And that, you know, intuition and improvisation. I'd never
And
thought
spontaneity.
And spontaneity. And so I was wondering what does it look like very practically in the studio to see Larry Bell making a cube, given what you've just said.
I have a few videos if you want to.
It's like tight walking at speed with spontaneity.
No. When I was doing that kind of work, there was no speed, and there was very little improvisation. And my ability to improvise with the composition really was limited to the orientation of one panel to the other panel. And so a cube has 6 sides. So in fact, there's an infinite number of possible permutations within the same format. That's why I like the cubes, because I could in a sense conceptually work at high speed by simply constantly improvising the relationship with the same size parts and never repeat myself, even though the format was the same.
Infinite.
Infinite.
Because you're moving.
Right. It's a factorial relationship between, I mean, infinite in the sense in my lifetime I could never do, I could never
You mean because every tiny adjustment is a variation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And plus, the relationship of my eye to the piece at any given time changed the volume of light contained within the pieces. And so at the Tate, I went to Tate yesterday and looked at 3 early pieces that are in the collection, and I was very pleased with how well they looked. And the kind of subtleties in the one rather clear cube that is there was still there, and as I moved around it, you have a limited view of this piece. I like the idea of the pieces floating out in the center of a room where one can walk around them, and if they're interested enough in becoming engaged with the thing, you can see an awful lot of interesting things that are happening simply by the fact that the light is absorbed or reflected or transmitted differently every moment of your cruise around it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
But you still want the videos.
Right. What's that?
But she still wants the videos, yeah. But we should have a
Yeah.
screening session here. I
Yeah.
think a few of us would want those.
Well, you can. If you go, my son has a Vimeo. My son's a videographer,
I saw that.
and he's done a lot of videos of me working in the studio, and you can see them being made on one of his Vimeo, Oliver Bell Vimeo.
Thank you.
How, given that your interest in minute difference and so on, and therefore the environment around you, the impact that it has, are you conscious of a significant difference or differences in the way that you approach your work or the work that you make in your different studios? You know, I know you have a studio in Taos and you have a studio in Venice. Do they have discernible differences? I mean, the quality of light must be different. But...
Well, they also have different mechanical systems that I use in the Taos studio in New Mexico. Is a large high vacuum thermal evaporator, which is essentially a plating device, English-made, I must say. It was a company called Edwards High Vacuum out of Crawley that built this thing for me, and it's enormous. And very heavy. It doesn't like to move, and so I moved it from Venice Beach originally to Taos, New Mexico, and that's where it is now. And it doesn't want to move again, at least not by me. And so I do all the surface preparation of things there, and then I take the work to California to either find a market for it or to proceed with being improvisational with the stuff. I live in a town of 8,000 people. There's less than 1 million people living in New Mexico. There's more people on Venice Beach on a 3-day weekend than live in New Mexico. So there's a bigger audience, a chance to show your work to more people that are interested.
Do you feel, are you more conscious in the studio? Is a studio a place where you're cut off from your immediate surroundings, or are you conscious of being more isolated when you're in Taos? I mean, does that happen?
No. It's
a practical thing.
Well, in both cases, it's this. I try to control my distractions. If you live in a place with 20 million people, then there's less chance of controlling your distractions than if you live in a town of 8,000. And they both nourish me in a different way. I have a much more active social life in LA than I do in New Mexico. But I moved to New Mexico to control my distractions. And so after doing so for 30 years, I decided this is pretty boring. I better get out there and find some action. And so I decided to jump back into the scene. And that's where Bernard Jacobson came by one day quite a few years ago and said, "What are you doing?" And I showed him what I was doing, and he said, "Oh, well, let's do something." And
Bernie, that was New Mexico?
No, this was in Taos. I mean, in Venice, in Venice Beach. He said, I want to visit you, and I said, I'm not. He called me on my cell phone. I was in Taos at the time. He said, I want to visit you. I said, I'm in Taos. He says, oh, I'm in LA, I'm going back. I said, I was coming out with a prototype of some work that I wanted to follow, and he said, well, I'll stay for a day, and he ended up staying 3 or 4 days, and we argued over this and that and the other thing, but he ended up buying a lot of stuff.
It's a pity, actually, because I'd rather envisage Bernie on a horse in New Mexico than in his swimming trunks on the beach, but both kind of work for me.
I almost killed him in a drive to Las Vegas. He reminded me yesterday that not by car, but by cigar smoke.
Held between two hands there, I hope. Of course, Bernie, yeah.
I mean, we've talked a lot, but one thing I don't know much about is you and Donald Judd, and I'd love to know a bit about that.
What do you want to know?
Well, I want to know how we got around to knowing your work and buying your work.
Oh, we met at a party that Barbara Rose threw. Barbara and Frank Stella and Barbara Rose threw a party for me after my first show at Pace Gallery, and that's where Donald came to the party, and that's when I met him. That was in 1965, and I just got to.
You remain friends.
Yeah. You know, he was a very strange guy, and I liked strange guys. There was, I mean, droll is the best. Amusingly odd. Okay, and I like people like that. I sort of gravitate to people that you're one of those.
Yes.
You mentioned briefly that, Larry, you collect work by other artists.
Pardon me?
You mentioned that you collect work by other artists. I think Tim did.
Well, actually, I said no, a collector. I think what I read it is that Larry collects shoes,
Hats.
guitars, hats,
Guitars.
Cool.
But do you collect
Cigar
work?
boxes.
Do you collect work by other artists?
I have a few things. I don't trust myself to own anything too valuable. I mean, Ken Price gave me work over the years, and we gifted each other things, but Kenny's things were so extraordinarily wonderful and so extremely fragile that I had little kids, and there's nothing they like better than breaking something that I liked very much, you know. So I ended up putting things away, and not owning things that I had to take a lot of responsibility for. So I'm not much of a collector, really.
But do the shoes or the cigar boxes? I mean, does that have an impact? Is that
well? I use them for art supplies. Actually,
okay.
I'm working on a piece right now with hats and cigars. It's an ongoing project.
There's an Ernst piece, isn't it, called "The Hat Makes the Man"? I'm not sure if anyone's ever done anything around cigar boxes, but there's always a first.
Well, I want to be first.
Yeah. Is there any more questions? I want to just ask a final question, because you mentioned that it wasn't till much later in life that you were diagnosed with a hearing issue.
Yes.
And you also said, I read, that actually it had having this diagnosed had a profound impact on your work, but you never explained how. What impact did it have, or how did it impact on your work?
Well, I couldn't work with the glass anymore. I stopped something about the massive input that was coming at me with when I got the hearing aids, which at first I thought I was Superman. I could hear people talking at the next table. I could hear birds in trees for the first time from outside. Those were the sounds that tires make when they're on. I never heard any of that stuff before, and when I got the diagnosis, got the machines, the world changed completely, and I went into a very strange kind of year full of black hallucinations that would just come on me as I was driving. Memories of my childhood, memories of being punished for doing things. I don't know where these things came percolating, but just things that had to do with being punished for doing what I was not what I was told not to do, and the frustration of the anger and frustration of a kid came back to me, of being told not to do this, not to do that, being told, and that profoundly stopped the work that I was onto, and that's when I reinvented myself into these collage things. There was a way of working very fast, and the faster I worked, the more things that came out, the less I was depressed.
So it was cathartic.
It was indeed, yeah. And I didn't know where I was going with the work, but I didn't care. All I cared about was not being in a funk, because I could. I mean, more than once I found myself white-knuckled to a steering wheel 50 miles past where I was going in some black rage, you know. I don't know how I didn't crash into something. I didn't remember any of the time between when it started and when I realized I was not where I was supposed to be. So the work helped, yeah. The work helped.
And is the fact that you're now thinking of working with glass again a sign that?
No. That was quite a while. That was quite a while ago that the change took place, you know. But slowly things, kind of curiosity and curiosity about. I need to do something. I need to be kind of hands-on with things. And when I decided I wanted to try and do another series of cubes, it was roughly 8 years since the last series of cubes. And the last series of cubes was prompted not by my curiosity for the work, but by an insurance claim that somebody had they lost a piece in transit and something, and wanted me to make another one, and so there was a considerable amount of money thrown at me to do it. And it's impossible to make one. You have to try and make 10 to get one, and that starts a run, and 10 is not enough, and you keep going, and so on. You know, then another 5-6 years of involvement goes by, and then I get tired of it and go back to work on paper.
Where are you at the moment?
Again, you know, I said the answer to where to go next is in the work, and that's proved itself again to me not too long ago, a few months ago, when I took one of the elements out of these collages that I've been working with, and took this sheet that was made to be a part of a two-dimensional thing and twisted it into 3 dimensions, and all of a sudden this single element from something I'd been working on since the early 80s two-dimensionally became a sculpture. And it had all of the elements of transmission, absorption, reflection that the sculptures that I'd made before, but there were no right angles in it, and there was no weight, and there was no mass, and so this was unquestionably out of my bag, and it was a gift from me, from what I had, a gift for me, from me. Out of the work, I was given the next step, and that's where I am right now.
That's great. Learning from the work, as you said, the work always giving.
Yeah. I don't think there's any. I think all artists do that in one way or another, and if we had one example of the different things I've done, I could show you exactly how this became this, and that it's almost a straight kind of path that I've walked.
Well, that's actually, I know you didn't mean it as an offer, but I'd like to take you up on that. I think next time you come to London, we should looking at some images and doing a public talk about how those things do map. You say that a lot of artists do that, you're right. A lot of artists give talks as well, and I think it's a very generous and sometimes difficult thing to do, but very few do it as well as you. Larry, thanks very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.